Hi again, everybody, and welcome to the podcast Love Letters to Pam, and also the YouTube channel Traveling with Jack and Pam. It's a potpourri of just about everything, and I've had some of the experts out there tell me if you just focus on one thing, you'd get a whole lot more subscribers and followers, but you know what? That's not really the point. I just enjoy doing the travel videos, cooking videos, and these grief support messages that sometimes roll into just being stories that I like to share. And that's what this is going to be about. It's going to be about sharing a story. And I've put it through my mind 3 or 4 times now, and I haven't really come up with how I want to share it. So I'm just going to go freeform here, and we'll see how it comes out. Point being, it's a Saturday, and I just got off the road for work. I was on the road from Sunday till today. I was up in the Washington, D.C. area and across parts of Northern Virginia. And in between my work, I got to do a couple of little activities. I went to the U.S. Capitol late one afternoon and actually called a session of the House of Representatives. And that was fascinating to watch that. And then just before my flight left, I had about a little 2-hour gap. And believe it or not, I toured Mount Vernon. And that's going to be the point of a video that I'll share with you here on the YouTube channel later as to how what should have actually been about at least a half a day devoted to Mount Vernon, that I did it in less than 2 hours, but it can be done. But here's where my story comes in. It was on an evening flight from Washington, D.C. Back to the Phoenix area. First leg of the flight was from D.C. to Columbus, Ohio. And ended up sitting next to a really nice guy who works in the accounting business. And we shared some stories about our life and things that had gone on with us, and talked about our kids, and talked about his wife, and talked about Pam, who is now in heaven. And really, really nice discussion. It seemed like we had a lot of the very same interest, a lot of the very same views. And so it was a nice, very pleasant conversation. And so then in Columbus, Ohio, I had a couple hour layover, and then switched over to my flight to go from Columbus to Phoenix, which was going to be a 4-hour flight. And as I sat down, I like to sit what's called, it's the row just before first class. So it's bulkhead, I think maybe is what it's called. But I always try and get that seat because you got lots of leg room. And while you're not in first class, it's almost like being in first class because you got a little more leg room, as I mentioned. So as I approached the seat, there was 2 people already sitting, one in the aisle, one in the middle. It was a younger woman, and then a guy who was maybe a few years younger than me, and then my window seat. So I scooted in and sat down. And who would have ever believed, this has really never happened to me on a flight, but the 3 of us talked the entire 4 hours. And I mean, we had some incredibly deep discussions from 3 very different points of view on different things, while at the same time we came together on a lot of things as well. I don't know if any of you ever saw, years ago, there was a movie called Grand Canyon. And I love that movie. It had Danny Glover, Steve Martin, a few other stars in it. It was basically a movie about people from varied backgrounds, very different views on things, came together. And in the end, they all end up going to the Grand Canyon together. And it almost felt like, for a time, in fact, we actually laughed during the flight a couple of times how, boy, if they had a camera rolling and a little background music, this would almost feels like a movie. It almost feels unreal. But the beauty of our conversations was that there was no script, kind of like what I'm doing here. We were just talking. And I want to share with you just a few of the things that came out of the conversation. First of all, we discussed our backgrounds. The one gentleman was in his 50s. He was from Tijuana, Mexico, but he was born in Newport Beach, California. He has a wife and a son. His wife's an attorney. He works in the computer field. And he travels a lot for his work. I had told him that I work in Christian radio. And he told me, well, that's cool. He says, but I'm an atheist. And I said, well, I said, I've known a few atheists in my life, agnostics, Christians, Catholics, Protestants, covers the spectrum. I wasn't going to tell him how to live his life. Then the woman, who was a good bit younger than us, was probably around 30 years old, is dating a wonderful young man who's in the military. And they hope to be married someday, soon. And she's a teacher in a Catholic school. But she was Presbyterian. And I told her, of course, I said, well, we used to be practicing Presbyterians. I said, we've also been Methodists, we've been Baptists, we've been them all. Through the course of the conversation, she also shared with us she had a relative who was gay. And so we talked a little bit about those issues surrounding the gay community. We talked about marriage. And we all came to an agreement that we thought marriage was one of the most beautiful things that can happen. And how it's so incredibly important to the stability of families and to our country. And I told them actually while I was in Washington that I'd actually done a program with an organization that's trying to help bring families back together across this country because some of the statistics are just absolutely dreadful. Believe it or not, as a country, we're now down to about 49% of the population is married. At the same time, too, we're seeing the collapse of families, and in many cases where people have chose to just live together and not get married, statistics are bearing out that those situations don't turn out very well. The commitments tend to wane, and things just don't turn out very good. I'm not going to get into all the details there. And that's what's funny too in this forum. I'm always a little careful about what I'm going to say because, I don't want to set off a firestorm of comments and people getting angry. And that's what happens on social media. People behind their screens and on their phones, they can say some really ugly, hurtful things. And a lot of them come from very different backgrounds. Now, the point being, though, the three of us sitting there on that airplane, all three of us came from incredibly different backgrounds. But you know what happened during that 4-hour flight? We bonded. We really did. We bore our souls. They told me things that were very deeply personal things that they shared with me. I shared with them very deeply personal things with them as well. The man, David was his name, and David then started talking a little bit about life and death. And I shared with him about that, I said, so I'll be honest, if I didn't have my faith that there was something beyond this life, I said, I don't think I could continue on if I thought this was it. And of course, he being an atheist, that kind of hit a little something with him. And I could tell that the wheels were turning in his head as well. And then he talked about, he said, I've never lost anybody super close like you did when you lost Pam. But he goes, I know it hurts, but he says, I'm always thinking about what's it going to be like how will I react when I really lose somebody really, really close to me? And I shared with him a story about how that I learned that when I used to hear of people who'd passed on and things like that when I was still married to Pam and, she's still here on this earth, I said I reacted then a lot differently from how I react now to when I hear about someone losing their life. I said, when you lose someone close to you, it changes your perspective on everything, and especially when it comes to those who pass on from this life. And I shared with him a couple of examples. I'm not going to get into those here. They're pretty personal, but in how I reacted. And I could tell that it helped him. It helped him understand a little more, as did the young woman as well. as we talked about that. We talked about kids and the things that they're facing in this world right now. Her being a school teacher, he has a 19-year-old son. I've got 2 kids. We all agree that what's happening now is really, really hard out there. We also talked about the effects of the pandemic and what that did to society. And it was interesting, the young woman who's a school teacher said she saw a dramatic difference in the kids following lockdowns and the pandemic. She says they were not as respectful. They tear up property. They didn't perform as well in the classroom. Just a myriad of problems. And the gentleman, David, said the same, and he was talking about how it's so hard and difficult to find employees nowadays who genuinely want to work, and that they have so many demands and things that they want before they'll come to work, and just how that has changed as well post-pandemic. We talked about the effects on the elderly population. We talked about the effects on people who didn't have a chance to tell their loved ones goodbye because they kept them isolated and would allow them to not get near them. The point being, we're going to see collateral damage from what was done with these lockdowns and things for years and years to come. We talked a lot about, as I mentioned, some of the problems with social media, but also some of the good about social media. The fact that we can share our stories like we're doing right now. She talked about how her boyfriend, fiance hopefully, is stationed in Japan. And she said, wow, I'm so thankful for social media because we're able to stay in touch thousands of miles apart. So again, those are all good things. So there's always some good out there as well. But the one conclusion that we all came to was how that 3 people from vastly different backgrounds who are also walking through life with some very different opinions and views on things came together for a 4-hour period of time, though, and truly enjoyed one another's company. We laughed. There were even a few tears shed, moments of seriousness. It was really amazing. It was really like that movie Grand Canyon. And I told them, I said, this is by far, hands down, the best airplane flight I've ever been on. And they agreed. They said, isn't it amazing how 3 strangers, we opened up to one another? And yes, we did exchange contact information. Will we talk again? Will we visit it again? Life gets busy. Life moves really fast. We may not, but I'll never forget that plane ride from Columbus, Ohio, back to Phoenix, Arizona. I'll never forget the stories that we shared. I'll never forget that despite some of our differences and opinions, we were able to come together. And that's really how it used to be. No, there's always been disagreements and people not getting along in this country and around the world. But there wasn't the degree of division that we see now across the lands. We used to be able to sit down and have civilized conversations and exchange our views and understand one another. And that was the beauty in this trip. That was the beauty in that flight. And as we deplaned in Phoenix, I shook David's hand. And the young woman, I asked her, I said, could I have a hug? And she says, you betcha. I cherish those hugs. And we hugged each other, and they had another flight to catch. Their trip was not over yet. They were heading to California, and of course he would eventually be back in Mexico. As I watched them walk away from the gate, I got a little sad because I thought, I'll miss my new friends. There was so much more we could have talked about. Could we have solved the world's problems? Oh, maybe I'm naive thinking, oh, maybe we could have. Probably not. But I do think it's important that people come together no matter what your views and opinions are. And, don't yell at each other. Don't tell people who's right, who's wrong. The other thing, too, that we discussed, and I'll wrap this up, was how that one thing about social media, though, is that everybody's an expert now. Everybody that's got a podcast, a YouTube channel, an Instagram, a TikTok, or whatever, they're all experts. And that's part of the problem, too. We got too many experts out there. And a lot of those experts don't have a clue what they're talking about, but they have followers. Heck, I'm not sure I know a lot about what I'm talking about. But the one thing that I want to always make very, very clear is I will never, ever force my views on you. I'm not going to tell you what's right, what's wrong. I'll share with you what, my opinions if you want to know them. I will be praying, though, for David that maybe he will eventually come around to having a belief in God. He talked about that his grandparents and most of his relatives have very strong Catholic affiliations and faith. And so who knows? Maybe some of the things that we shared on that flight will resonate with him. Even if David at this time doesn't believe in God, doesn't mean I don't still care for David. I can't love David just like anybody else. And I truly enjoyed my visit with him. So that's about it. I truly enjoyed my time. 3 people, 3 different demographics, 3 different backgrounds, 3 different occupations, 3 different opinions and views on life that came together on an airplane flight. The only advice I'll give, and you didn't ask me for any advice, is open yourself up to others. Open yourself up to the possibilities. Be a good listener. And you never know. You may make some new friends just like I did. Hey, thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Share this if you will. If you thought this message was decent and might help somebody that you know, share it. That's all I ask. Until we see you next time, you know what we always say. Make it a great day. Better yet, a better tomorrow. Bye now.